It's Halloween! Time for writing spooky stuff. So let's talk about spooky stuff. What sort of evocative writing tricks can we talk about today? Let's discuss all of the methods that Lovecraft and other people have used to create spookiness. We're talking about Lovecraft because a lot of people seem to think that Lovecraft is the only thing of that type, and that's just not true. There have been thousands of people that have used the same basic techniques for the same basic reasons, so you don't have to keep cribbing from Lovecraft. We can crib from a lot of people. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's talk about some of the basics here. We're talking about evocative writing. Now, normally when you hear evocative, it's about poetry or music, but it's also very powerful in a narrative sense. So why would you want evocative writing? Well, here's your brain. Here's your eyeball. You're playing D&D with some GM. And the GM, you're approaching a castle, and there is a squid in the moat. A giant octopus in the moat. And the GM has to be like, I have to describe this to them. How do I describe it to them? There's a giant octopus in the moat. Well, that's not very evocative. It tells the players what they need to know, but it lets the players pressure-free build up their own mental model of what's going on, build up their own judgment of what's going on, and decide how to feel about it. And this usually breaks down to some statistical thing like, are we powerful enough to take on an octopus? Evocative writing is a different approach. It intends to overwrite this crap. So, you might describe it as, in the depths of the trench there is black mud and it roils. Sickly bubbles weave their way to the surface and burst, letting out green gases, and yellow eyes from the depths glare up. That's evocative. It might not be any good, but it's evocative. And the idea here is that you are using purple prose to force the player to have a specific mental model, to force the player to have a specific judgment, and to force the player to feel specific things. So the idea here is that you are trying to knock their brain offline and replace it with what the story is actually about. And this is a sliding scale. I mean, you're going to use some of this in everything. So you're always going to be pushing some kind of mental model or judgment or feeling into the audience's brain. But in this sort of story, you take it really, really far and you use really, really aggressive purple language. Now, I talked about purple language, and that's when you use language that's supposed to evoke a response like that. So, roiling depths and glaring yellow eyes. Fine, right? But we have a lot more power than that because we have some kind of player character or audience surrogate in the story, and we can have them have physiological responses. So, for example, if you walk into a 10 by 10 room and it's on fire, the GM might say you walk into a 10 by 10 room and it's on fire. Not great. But instead the GM can say, you open the door and you're immediately blasted off your feet by white-hot flames. Your eyebrows burn away in a second, and when your vision clears, you can see a narrow path between walls of fire. This has physiological responses built into it, and the player is forced to accept those physiological responses as part of their reality. This tells them what their mental model has to be. This tells them what sort of judgments they have to have, and this tells them how to feel. And it's no longer a matter of fire does 1d4 damage every round. It is now a matter of, okay, I'm worried. That hurt. I'm screwed up. If I go in there, that's really like, wow, I don't really want to go in there anymore. So that's the whole point. Whether you're talking about using evocative language or whether you're talking about having a physiological response built in to the players, it's all about forcing the players to have their own mental models, to make their own... all that stuff stops working. They can't make their own models. They can't make their own judgments. They can't have their own feelings. The story tells them how to feel, how to judge, and how to model. This is something that you can overdo pretty easily. If you overdo it, the player or audience will dissociate and they'll just stop caring. So it's like, yeah, I don't care about your roiling depths, or I didn't tell my player character to do that, so I don't feel like I'm this player character anymore. Now it's just some guy. This is a serious problem. This kind of dissociation can easily take hold, and it's a fine line to walk, and it really depends on the genre and the expectations of your audience members and how long they've been in your grip. So it's something where you have to be very careful, especially in a game where they might turn the game off and then come back the next day, and they're not going to be in the depths of your purple prose anymore. And if you hit them right up front with more purple prose, they're going to be like, yeah, whatever. This was stupid. How was I ever into this in the first place? So it's a very, very fine line to walk. It's also not a line that is just horror-centric. Every genre uses this kind of approach. For example, if you are in some sort of noir adventure and you've got, your street light and your guy with a hat and a trench coat, and he's definitely not a flasher, at least you hope not, because that had better be a pistol in his hand. And you're trying to determine how to tell this story. Well, you can do the same things. You can have purple language. She was trouble. I knew the moment she walked in that she was going to turn my life upside down. That's purple prose. Or you can use physiological responses. His fist hit like a brick and my nose crunched like 12-day-old bread. These sorts of things are evocative enough that they're going to work out. Even if they're a little bit subpar, the audience will buy into that. They'll get into the groove of it, and that will make them feel specific things. It'll make them have a specific mental model of the situation, and it will make them judge it in a specific way. And that's the whole point, regardless of the genre. Here's the thing. It's also not just about the prose you're using. It's all about the storytelling, whether that storytelling is visual or through prose or through sound or whatever. It's always about invoking a response or evoking a response. So let's talk a little bit about everybody's least favorite, Lovecraft. Lovecraft's stories are popular because they're not just evocative in terms of language. They're evocative in terms of story structure. So, the story, in most examples, is that there is a little village on the coast, and it's full of squid men, and you find out that they're squid men, so they kill you. Woo! And all of the stories can be boiled down to this kind of really dumb, basic summary, right? And this is not just true of this is not a specific thing. This is not Lovecraft's weakness. This is true of everything. Like Poe, you can summarize Poe's stuff. Guy kills another guy, goes steadily insane. Ooh, how unevocative can you be, right? So when you are unfolding the story, it's all about hitting that mental model that the player has or the audience has of the story and keeping it in a position where by the time they've figured out the shallowness of your story, you've reframed it so that it's not about that. By the time we get to the point where we realize that these dudes are just squid men, it's not about whether or not these dudes are squid men. It's about this guy and how terrified he is and how he's desperately searching for a way to get through this. How the horrors he's discovering have made him come undone, even if the horrors are not very horrible to us. These are powerful because we are empathizing with this dead guy so much. Even though the things he's discovering are dumb, his physiological responses become our physiological responses. And this is a technique that's used across the board everywhere. For example, a children's show. And then, Lex Luthor's stolen 40 cakes. That's 10 times, that's 10. That's 4 tens, and that's horrible. This isn't horrible, but then you can then cut across to Superman's shocked face. Oh my gosh, Lex, what are you doing? And, if his face is shaped correctly, the audience knows that they're supposed to feel a specific way, and they do. They get that physiological response, they incorporate it into their mental model, and it works. It's a very, very soft form of this. That's why children's shows constantly cut away to characters' faces. It's to make sure that the audience knows what they're supposed to be feeling. We sort of get away from that when we turn into adults and we write more adult fiction. We sort of think of that as cheap. But really it's not. That's the core. When we talk about, some guy going to Ipswich and getting stabbed to death, it's all about how that guy feels. And maybe you can be more nuanced about it than showing close-ups of his horrified face. But maybe you don't have to be. Maybe close-ups of his horrified face are enough for what you're trying to tell. Let's go ahead and give you an example of how to make a story that is evocative at a story level, at a narrative level, how it unfolds in the player's mind. So, scene opens in a Midwestern town, and there is a pile of bloody teeth, bloody human teeth on the floor, a full-mouthed set of bloody teeth. And then we cut to the policeman looking shocked, like, what the hell is this? And then cut to someone picking them up one by one with pincers and putting them in a bloody plastic bag. And then cut to someone stirring their coffee with the same sort of motion, just to have a nice cut. And then, they go over to, the cop is walking out to see the dentist, and he's drinking his coffee, and he's like, So whose teeth were those? It's like, oh, it was Jim Bob's teeth. Oh, we better let Mrs. Bob know. Oh, I'll give her the bad news. So go out to Mrs. Bob and say, Mrs. Bob, Jim Bob, I'm afraid that I've got bad news. We didn't find his body, but we found all of his teeth. And then Jim Bob comes in from the back, and he's smiling and looking fine. He's saying, I have all my teeth. I don't know what you're talking about. It's like, what is this? So this sort of story is a very simple setup for any number of possible final stories. The twist here can be anything. Maybe Jim Bob's a werewolf, and the werewolf transformation is a little bit unusual. You have to make werewolf transformations unusual because we've seen the normal one too many times. You have to focus on creating a deep response, a physiological response to the werewolf transformation. And one way we could do that is that when they transform into a werewolf, all of their human teeth come ripping out of their face when their fangs come in. It's grotesque and brutal, and it really probably would work very well. And we could make it anything, but this is a good idea, a standard werewolf story, except by the time we learn that it's a standard werewolf story, it's no longer about what kind of story it is. It's about Jim Bob and this policeman and Mrs. Bob. It's about whatever's going on in the world. You've created a mental model that is so focused that when a fact like, oh, it's a werewolf story enters into it, it should just bounce off. It should be like, it's not a werewolf story, it's the werewolf story. They shouldn't feel, oh, well, I have to watch out for Silver, or, oh, this werewolf only turns in full moon or whatever. It's not about that. It's about this specific story. It's the same technique that you might use to tell a story about squid men off the coast of Maine or whatever, but it's not set up to just reveal the ending arc. You pull the player in or pull the audience in by setting up a mental model and revealing it bits by bits. And then the reveal isn't really a reveal. It's not there to surprise or shock. It's just there to keep moving the story forward. You see the difference? This can be used in any kind of story you'd like. For example, if you're telling a noir story, you don't always have to make them murder mysteries where the reveal at the end is whodunit. That's just one kind of approach. In the Nero Wolfe stories, for example, Nero Wolfe is a big fat guy, so we'll draw a big fat guy. The Nero Wolfe stories, for example, you almost always know who is the murderer and what happened right up front. And the story is about this goofy fat guy and this spry sidekick he's got looking around trying to solve the case. And it's not about who killed who. It's about why did they do that? What drove them to this? Why did they hate so deeply? And how are our two friends going to get through this with their lives and integrity intact? And it works great. Lots of people love Nero Wolfe stories. I love Nero Wolfe stories. They're not murder mysteries, and that's what people often hold against them. But they're not supposed to be murder mysteries. They're simply noir stories where the murder is the central kicking off ground, the central thing that happens to make everything else unroll. So that's the basic idea here. You're setting up a mental model, and by the time you've got it established, it's no longer about the story's plot. It's all about what's happening. And there's a big difference there. And the big difference is that what's happening makes you feel something. It evokes a response. Whereas the story's plot is just what's happening. That's, it's not really going to evoke any responses. It's just someone writing it down in dry form on a whiteboard or something. Yes, Jim Bob is a werewolf. Not very evocative. We found Jim Bob's teeth. That's pretty evocative. You see what I'm saying? Anyway, these are the basics, and I've covered the primary means of doing this, but there is one thing I haven't talked about, and that is, I keep saying something like, the mental model, the mental model, the mental model. And a lot of people probably don't really realize how important this is, because the mental model is not just what's going on, but also how it affects things and how to parse things. So if your mental model is correct, then when things happen in the story, you'll be like, got it, yeah, When your mental model is incorrect, you'll be like, what? So there's a fine line here, because when you're feeding the audience the mental model, you can feed them an incorrect mental model. Or you can feed them a mental model that's correct, but only for this part of the story. The problem is that if you say it's a werewolf story and Jim Bob is a werewolf, that mental model is too vast. The story vanishes into it like a drop of water into an ocean. Instead, what you need to have is a mental model that is tightly focused so that you can tell a tightly focused story. And by the time the mental model is large enough to say, oh, werewolves, it's no longer the focus. The oh, werewolves part is just an added fact somewhere. Instead, the mental model is tightly focused on Jim Bob and on who's doing what to whom and exactly what Jim Bob can do and why he's doing it. That's what the mental model is. Now, it's really important to manipulate this mental model aggressively. Regardless of how purple you're going to go, having control over this mental model is critical to writing a story with any kind of tension in it. So when you are telling the story about people in the squid people here, that's fine, and you can summarize that in such a way that it works out. But let's say that we're talking about a giant squid god comes up to eat you, and we can describe that as giant squid god comes up to eat you, but we can also describe it using other kinds of techniques that create an incorrect mental model. We can say things like, from unknowable time comes an eldritch demon whose plans cannot be understood. We could call them malevolent, but malevolent is a human term and it has no meaning to such a being. What you're doing is you're giving them a mental model that is incorrect. The story is there's a giant squid and it's coming to eat you. Their mental model is there is an ancient god of unknowableness coming to eat you. And that's a big difference. So when you build up a mental model, you can build up the wrong mental model on purpose and make it so they cannot comprehend your story while they're watching it because their model is wrong. And that's one of the things that Lovecraft does really well. With someone like Poe, you can understand what's going on. It unrolls with a marvelous pace and really makes you feel it, but you know what's going on. But when you have someone like Lovecraft, you're like, what? Because he's told you the wrong stuff. He's misled you on purpose. And that's not the only way that you can have misleading models, because there are lots of ways that you can sabotage the model that's in the audience's mind. One way is to tell them the wrong stuff. Another way is to just friggin' blow it up. So, let's talk about psychedelia. Psychedelia, as you may know, is basically just drug trips. And the idea here is that you hit the player with sensory overload. They cannot parse what they're seeing. Now, if you do it wrong, then it's just a light show and the player's like, whatever. But if you do it right, then you imply that they cannot possibly understand what you've been leading to. And this is like the end of 2001, right? End of 2001, he turns into a space baby. But by leaning into the psychedelia, they make it feel like he's gone beyond the boundaries of human existence. He's into an unknowable time and space. All of reality is yawning, and he's trying not to yawn himself. This sort of visual allows you to short-circuit the audience's brain and basically say, yeah, here's your mental model, null. And if it's done right, it works great. The problem is that you have to make sure that your audience is in the right place to have their mental model overwritten by garbage. That's something that everybody is not good at. Lovecraft was great at it because he was using such purple prose, and it would get more and more purple, and at the end you're like, it's so purple, I'm drowning in purple. And then he says, yeah, and you cannot comprehend. And you're like, okay, I can't comprehend, it's fine, I can't understand. But with a movie, it's actually really hard to do that because you can see what's happening. So in order to make the psychedelia work out, you've got to really focus on making sure that the player is ready to buy a direct sensory overload, that the audience is really ready to buy a direct sensory overload. There's a lot of ways to do that. You can prime them for it using smaller psychedelia tricks. You can also make them feel like the personal context is what matters more than the objective truth. So they are seeing more like what people feel rather than what's actually happening. And you can sort of feel that unrolling in 2001, which starts as a pretty staid sci-fi film, but as you move on, it becomes clear that what's really happening here is that the emotions are what matters, rather than the actual plot. It's all about what people feel and how people are connected, and what sort of things are happening in their life, rather than the story itself. And then when they hit you with the ending, you're like, okay, this is an emotional thing. This is the culmination of our movement into emotional space. And maybe you didn't feel that. Maybe you didn't like the ending of 2001. But the basic idea is the same regardless of how you set it up. Psychedelia is used to shut down your ability to create mental models. If the player or audience member is not ready to have that shut down, it's not going to work. So, that's what I wanted to say. Psychedelia and Gothic purple prose have the same end goal. So go out there and write some scary stuff, or some psychedelic stuff, or some noir stuff. Whatever you feel like. Just don't steal from other authors, because you're going to inherit whatever they put in their story, and those are not usually the things you're going to want in your story. So make your own story using these techniques. I look forward to it.